Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar, Preparing for the 2025 Threat Landscape. This event, brought to you by Security Magazine, is sponsored by AlertMedia. And now I'm excited to turn it over to today's presenters. Katie Goen will introduce them to you.
Thank you so much, Taylor. And hello, everyone. Yes, I'm Katie Goen, Director of Content and Communications at AlertMedia, and I'll be your moderator today. We really appreciate you joining us for this discussion. We'll be talking about preparing for the 2025 threat landscape. Our speakers have some fantastic data and content for us today, which is all based on findings from AlertMedia's 2025 Threat Outlook Report, which is something that we do annually. So this year, the title of the report is The Cascade Effect, Emerging Trends in the Threat Landscape. So let's go ahead and get into it. I'd love to introduce you all to today's speakers. First, we have Sara Pratley with us today. Sara is Vice President of Global Intelligence at AlertMedia, where she leads a team of experienced analysts who are responsible for monitoring and alerting on emerging threats worldwide. Before joining AlertMedia, Sara was Vice President of National News for CNN. Hi, Sara. It's great to have you here today.
Hey, Katie. Great to be here. Looking forward to diving in.
Excellent. Well, thanks for taking the time. I'd also like to introduce Peter Steinfeld. He is the Senior Vice President of Safety Solutions at AlertMedia. He's been in the communications industry for more than 20 years now, and he's helped organizations of all sizes and industries really level up their employee safety, business continuity, and emergency preparedness initiatives. He's also the host of the Employee Safety Podcast. Hi, Peter. Thanks for being here.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I do want to just dive into today's agenda, so we can all see what we will be talking about today. First, the cascade effect, right? What is it and what is its role in today's threat environment? Then we'll talk about 6 primary threats that are really shaping preparedness efforts for 2025. We'll talk about some emerging threats that are on our radar and why those should be top of mind. And then finally, we'll talk to you about how to prepare your people and your business for what's to come this year. So I'm going to go ahead and launch our first poll actually right now. So you're going to see these pop up throughout the presentation, and we would love to get your feedback. So please participate in those as you see them arise. So the first question that we have for you today is, do you feel more or less prepared to protect your people from emerging threats than you were at this time last year? So you could say that you feel more prepared, less prepared, or maybe it's just about the same. So I'm going to give that just a few seconds for you guys to get those answers locked in. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and share those results, and I'll get Peter and Sara's perspective on them. All right, so let's go ahead and close that out and we can see some results. All right. So 55% of our folks are saying about the same. But we also have folks saying more prepared and less prepared. So clearly we have folks across the board on the call today. Let me go to you, Sara. Is that surprising to you at all, or about what you thought you'd see today?
You know, I think I'm always surprised when we ask people whether they feel more or less or about the same from preparedness. I think it just kind of speaks to the fact that even, all of us probably go through cyclical points during the year where we do feel more or less prepared. I think there's obviously always more preparedness. I think about the same, right? I think that resonates with a lot of people as we continue to build on our skills and our preparedness every year, but also the landscape just continues to change. So kind of that ebb and flow too. Peter, what do you think?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. And a lot of it has to do with how recently you experienced something bad. If it was very recent, you didn't feel like you did well with that situation, then obviously it's like, oh no, I feel way less prepared. But then that confidence changes as you start to address those issues. So to your point, very cyclical.
Thank you, guys. I think that makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, let's get into content now. And I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Peter. He's going to talk about the cascade effect and why it was such a major theme for the 2025 Threat Outlook Report. Peter, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. So as we start off here, as threats continue to grow in scale, frequency, and complexity worldwide, business resilience really takes on a new urgency. And that's why AlertMedia releases an annual threat outlook report that examines all sorts of data and trends from the last year in order to understand the upcoming threat potential for next year. We can learn a lot just by looking at the past. With these insights, you can really better anticipate challenges and then bolster your risk management strategies. And I mean, really the goal is to enhance your organization's ability to thrive. As we were working with a lot of subject matter experts to compile this year's report, we realized that many critical events in 2024 involved what we called the cascade effect, as Katie said, which I'll explain more on the next slide. So essentially, the cascade effect is a chain of events that occurs as a direct or indirect result of a primary event or some kind of inciting incident. For example, let's say lightning strikes a power line and causes a power outage. As a result, the electrical failure, a traffic light is out, and a car crash occurs, injuring a driver, let's say. So in this instance, the lightning strike is the primary incident, and the power outage, the car crash, and the injury are all the cascading impacts. Now, in today's threat landscape, a single incident can really trigger a cascade of impacts that reverberate across lots of different industries and regions. So as we go to the next slide, looking at the 2024 events specifically, these 5 examples of the cascade effect really stand out. First is the Israel-Hamas conflict. So the attack back on October 7th of 2023 is the primary event for the war, which then resulted in cascading impacts ranging from broader conflict in the Middle East and a lot of different supply chain disruptions to a humanitarian crisis in Gaza and a lot of worldwide protests. Next, the CrowdStrike outage. The inciting incident was obviously the faulty software update that was released, causing a widespread glitch. And then the cascade effect caused everything from complete work stoppages to flight cancellations. That impacted me. I was stuck in an airport, to things like non-functioning hospitals, not good, and a lot of other really important services worldwide. The UK riots, another example. The primary event was a stabbing attack in Southport that killed 3 children and injured several more. And then the cascading impacts ranged from hate speech and the spread of misinformation to extremist violence and hundreds of arrests. Another is Hurricane Beryl. The Category 5 hurricane made landfall originally in Texas, which was the inciting incident. And then the cascade effect caused tornado outbreaks, lots of flooding, tons of power outages, and heat-related deaths and injuries. And then lastly, the recent Mexico elections. So Mexico held its general elections in early June, which was the primary event. And then it cascaded into record levels of political violence. The entire federal judiciary was going on strike, a lot of major protests, and then concerns about trade agreements with other countries. So again, these crises demonstrate how just a single event can have a really widespread set of ramifications and lasting business impacts in areas that you may have never expected. And I'm certain that we're going to see even more examples of this cascade effect this year. So now for AlertMedia's 2025 Threat Outlook report, we identified these 6 prominent trends from 2024 that influenced employee safety, physical security, and business continuity that we believe will continue to shape preparedness efforts for the coming year. So we'll be exploring each of these trends at a high level throughout today's presentation, maybe get a little bit deep on some of them. But to do that, Sarah, I'll go ahead and kick it over to you to get us started with our first trend.
Awesome. Sounds good. Thanks, Peter. So for the first trend, we're going to go ahead and start with climate. This, of course, being a trend that really affects every organization, no matter size, location, or industry. So to start, here's a rather eye-opening statistic we'd like to share. New reports estimate that climate change is increasing at an alarming rate. These are a lot of headlines that I'm sure a lot of us have seen. New reports estimate that climate is increasing at this alarming rate, human-induced warming increasing by 0.26 degrees Celsius per decade. The extreme weather, natural disasters caused by this sort of shift really pose a universal risk to organizations around the world, all of us, again, no matter where we are or industry. And these events can really cause immediate harm to the lives of those impacted, of course, but also have long-term and far-reaching impacts across the global landscape to businesses as well. So 2024 was also the hottest year on record. That's according to the World Health Organization. Heat and flooding are really, really, really big concerns for us as we dive into these reports. Heat being very dangerous. Heat stress is actually the leading cause of weather-related deaths. These sorts of fatalities increasing by 117% in the US since 1999. And then in Europe, heat deaths are also on the rise. They could actually triple by the end of this century. Beyond deaths, extreme heat has really wide-reaching infrastructure impacts, everything from disrupting air travel, damage to roads, bridges, a lot of infrastructure impacts right there. Also critical to different data centers. They obviously run the risk of overheating. And an impact maybe a little bit less thought about is that increasing global temperatures are also exacerbating things like seasonal allergies, as well as mosquito-borne illnesses. Again, two of the other climate trends that we're really tracking very closely. We've got a team of meteorologists who is very passionate about tracking these trends. Flooding and drought really fall high on their list as well. A little bit of a science lesson here. Increased temperatures really lead to more water in the atmosphere. And then with more water suspended in the atmosphere, we see a significantly heavier rainfall and heavier rainfall events that can cause that catastrophic flooding around the globe. Many of you will remember in May and then again in September of 2024, different severe flooding events that actually swept across Europe, leading to everything from evacuations. We saw structural damage, dozens of deaths in certain areas, and then parts of South Asia as well also saw severe flooding and landslides from a very heavy and early monsoon season. And then on the other hand, the Mediterranean, North Africa, parts of South America as well really faced that catastrophic drought through the summer. Italy alone lost 25% of agricultural production due to the water restrictions. It cost the country up to 2.7 billion euros. So just hugely significant costs associated with that, but also the ripple effect of those agricultural impacts too. And then separately, prolonged droughts in places like Brazil can also spawn wildfires, right? 180,000 total wildfires from January to August of last year just in Brazil, causing not only the devastation and destruction that the wildfires come with, but also air quality concerns, flight cancellations, energy crises as well. Hurricanes and typhoons, those are also persistent threats that we really want to continue to focus on. 2024 Atlantic hurricane season saw a record-breaking start. Peter mentioned Hurricane Beryl earlier. It was the earliest Category 5 storm in history. There were several intense storms in October as well, including Helene and Milton. In total, we had 5 hurricanes that actually made landfall in the U.S., so a pretty busy season. And then when you think about other parts of the world and the tropical activity, typhoons Yagi and Marseille proved even more catastrophic, bringing really intense flooding, landslides throughout the Philippines, China, Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, Myanmar, so many locations that were impacted by those storms, damaging homes, structures, roads, bridges, dams, lots of impacts to the power grid, to farmland, all amplified by more severe weather that actually continued to hit the region. So whether it's one or dozens of storms, common wisdom has always been that it really just takes one bad storm that can cause a crisis to the region, and again, those ripple impacts. But of course, with the effects of climate change, we seem to be dealing with back-to-back incidents, little recovery time, and of course, this waterfall of impacts in local regions and beyond. All right, the next prominent threat on our list is the rising global election tensions. 2024, of course, was a landmark year, and we are in for a lot of activity this year as well. So 2024 was a super election year. That's what a lot of us called it. Y'all probably remember different terminology around it. We had more than 70 countries that actually held national elections across the year. That was over 4 billion people worldwide that were eligible to vote in those elections. In countries that had flaring political tensions, we saw a lot of elections that actually sparked violence, different disruptions. So we'll continue, to see a lot of major elections in the coming months. We're going to be watching elections in places like Germany, in Canada, the Philippines, Belarus, Japan, Portugal, so many other countries that we'll be keeping an eye on this year. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the impacts that we can see when we think about elections in general, but especially as we're looking ahead to these elections in 2025. So unfortunately, with extremism, polarizing political rhetoric on the rise, both here in the United States as well as really globally, organizations are definitely likely to face ongoing risks related to civil unrest and a volatile geopolitical landscape in this year ahead. So two prominent and notable examples I think that are worth mentioning from the past several months. Mexico, Peter, you mentioned this a little bit before, but in Mexico, the 2024 presidential election saw a ton of violent activity. More than 330 different incidents of violence actually flared up against political figures in Mexico. That was actually the highest level of political violence ever recorded in the country. And then, of course, here in the United States, we had two assassination attempts, as well as one foiled assassination plan from Iran against now President-elect Donald Trump. So definitely a lot to reflect back on as we're starting to look towards the future as well. Elections are also often known to be spurring activism, right? In many cases, civil unrest. We saw a number of notable incidents over the past year. France, hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets to protest far-right movements leading up to the elections in June and July. A lot of political uncertainty that's still ringing true there. Germany, too, saw a similar explosion of protests in response to the growing support for their far-right party, the Alternative for Germany, AfD party. Protests that are expected to continue to ramp up as we're getting really close to national elections there. Those were actually moved up after a failure of the government there. So we'll see Germans going to the polls in late February, so just weeks away. The disruptions caused by protests and demonstrations like these and others for really any cause can have significant impacts on everything from travel, supply chain, general business disruptions in any area, and then particularly, of course, concerning when they can lead to violence in many cases, as we've seen globally over the past several years. Then there's foreign interference, misinformation. Those are two other really important topics as we think about global elections and what we've experienced in the past several months, as well as what we're watching for in these coming months. Cyber attacks on political candidates, social media manipulation, cyber espionage, all of these things have played really key roles in elections around the globe to some degree. Foreign and domestic actors have also used misinformation and disinformation. So everything from spreading false information about voting processes, campaign platforms, political connections, even false acknowledgments of election losses. So these influences really elevate that risk surrounding elections by escalating any political divides and really sometimes monopolizing and capitalizing on those, oftentimes, again, leading to more volatility and civil disruptions. They can also increase confusion, disenfranchisement for already marginalized groups too, which is something we keep a close eye on. And then we talk about AI a lot, and I think for good reason here. It's a really important theme as we talk about this area. So as generative AI tools are making it a lot easier to create falsified information and to spread that information, there's a lot of need for vigilance. I think this is a good reminder for all of us about the vigilance around different topics, different information that's being shared, and of course, different tools that are used around the election and around the election year, but also just in general as businesses. All right, so the third trend topic that we're going to focus on is geopolitical strife as it relates to multiple ongoing conflicts around the globe. And we've got an unfortunate stat that we'll share off the top here. So geopolitical stability continues to decline. It continued to decline in 2024 with peacefulness actually deteriorating in 97 countries globally. That included 23 nations across Europe. So organizations obviously can't function in isolation. And the rippling impacts of things like war, civil instability are going to continue to be focuses for 2025, likely resulting in extensive costs for organizational security and for global supply chains. So there's a number of factors that I think are really important to keep in mind here. One of the big ones that we continue to experience, of course, is concurrent wars, right? The ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine in Eastern Europe, and then the Israel-Hamas war in the Middle East have really caused widespread refugee crises. They've spawned cyber threats, so much more. Two areas I would highlight on this list of particular interest for the global business community have really been those demonstrations related to these events, as well as the impacts to the supply chain. So on the demonstration side, these conflicts have resulted in massive global protests, which have caused significant disruptions in so many locations and in some cases violence. I was actually just talking to our strategic team that tracks a lot of these. In many locations, we're continuing to see these things just consistently over time progress. So that's something we'll be watching a lot in 2025. And then the supply chain impacts have been numerous and reverberating as well. shipping delays, port congestion, overall rise in supply chain costs. One of the biggest examples of this being ships avoiding the Red Sea due to missiles by terror groups in the region. This area was used to seeing a third of global container ship traffic, and now ships are diverting thousands of miles around Africa. And what does that mean? Of course, it means more time, it means more money, and of course, that domino effect on both businesses and consumers globally. And then terrorism, this is another element of the geopolitical landscape that I think is pretty important to highlight and can't be forgotten. While large-scale terrorist attacks like the deadly concert hall shooting that we saw in Moscow just over a year ago have lessened somewhat in recent years, terrorism is still clear and present risk in many, many parts of the world. Domestic extremist groups in particular are connected to a rise in terrorist threats and activities that pose significant danger to public safety and organizational operations. In the UK, they've actually experienced a spike in reports of terrorism in the wake of the war in the Middle East, alongside a rise in protests, as I mentioned earlier, as well as a rise in hate crimes. And then here in the United States, that New Year's crowd ramming that we saw, that tragedy in New Orleans a couple of weeks ago, is another example in this area. Also notable last year, maybe on the smaller scale, but something that I think worth highlighting, Springfield, Ohio, a lot of different incidents happening there around the election with misinformation that was perpetuated oftentimes by different candidates, potentially supporters. So this movement towards more domestic threats will definitely require a different approach for navigating terrorism this year, and something to certainly keep an eye on. All right, let's go ahead and transition and talk about our next threat, which is economic uncertainty. A bit of a spoiler alert on this one. The economic headwinds of 2024 are very likely to persist as the complex web of geopolitical tensions, policy changes, supply chain disruptions, all of these things continue to intertwine over time. And of course, your organizational resilience will really rely on a lot of these things and the ability to potentially do more with less, even as a lot of these threats that we're facing are increasing and oftentimes becoming more complex. So to kick this section off, I'm just going to share a quick statistic here that you might find interesting. Global disinflation remained uneven in 2024 and was exacerbated, by protracted wars and softness in labor markets. This was actually according to the World Economic Outlook update. If you can't tell, we really like to share data, which is good. I think it's a really important part of focuses in these areas. So consumers and organizations continue to feel economic strain as prices stay high in a lot of categories, including groceries, which is, I'm sure, something that we have all seen and can relate to. And it's also very well outlined here in this global monthly food price index, this graph that we're sharing here. The war in Ukraine has also had significant contributions to surging energy prices across Europe. As well as those attacks on the Red Sea that I mentioned earlier. Those have actually caused a 66% decline in shipments through the Suez Canal, again, drawing direct correlations to increases in shipping times, as well as increase in costs that are continuously domino effect transferred down to businesses as well as consumers. And then additionally, lagging wages in many countries are really leading to workforce retention and morale difficulties. It is a certainty that businesses will really have to continue to navigate these cost pressures while also dealing with policy uncertainty, potential fiscal instability, really considering all of these ongoing geopolitical tensions in 2025 that are, again, very important to continue to pay attention to. My team does a lot to track activism for our customers. Labor activism in particular has really intensified and been a big focus. This, image showing the United States, but also just on that global scale. So the map that you see here actually reflects the number of labor strikes in the United States alone for the better part of 2024. Globally, we saw more than 250 different strikes in 2024 in a number of different industries, everything from construction to retail, healthcare, manufacturing, and shipping. So all really prominent industries that I know we all rely on in different ways in our businesses. And then these labor challenges have widespread consequences, right? We can think about the Canadian Rail Union's shutdown strike in September. It was actually estimated to require up to 5 days of recovery for every work stoppage day that was involved. And then another related factor, right, on the hiring front, many major US companies in things like tech and finance, manufacturing, a lot of these industries also have over time announced significant layoffs, hiring freezes amid market contractions. And then the UK, on the other hand, I think it's important to note they've been experiencing critical staffing shortages. 51% of HR managers actually reported retention as a top worry amid record high turnover vacancy rates. So that's an interesting and I think an important stat to remember. And these global dynamics, of course, underscore that interconnectedness of our labor markets, as well as widespread costs of economic pressures on that workforce stability. So in every industry, cyber attacks are increasing in frequency and costs, really resulting in data breaches that impact millions of individuals. So that's what we'll focus on for our fifth threat here, with security, data privacy, and reputation on the line here. Organizations, of course, really needing to prioritize this threat, not only this year, but in the years to come. So cybercrime, for all the reasons we know, remains at the top of a lot of business threat lists. It's expected to actually reach $10.5 trillion in global annual damages this year alone. That number, again, continuing to tick up. The numbers in all of these areas that we think about with cyber are always staggering. We've got a recent report actually showing that there were 2,700 plus publicly disclosed events that happened in the United States in just a 6-month period, November 2023 to April 2024. And in that period, nearly 7 billion known data records that were breached. So again, a 6-month snapshot in time, and those are just the cases that were actually reported. So you can think about the fact that it was likely exponentially higher. So whether your role actually directly or indirectly is responsible for cyber, I think we can all agree that cyber attacks really continue to be a huge concern for all organizations, no matter the size, no matter the location, no matter the industry. And each week, hundreds, thousands of organizations around the globe really experience cyber attacks. A lot of it's demonstrated very neatly in this graph that we see here that is provided by Checkpoint. In 2024, some very high profile incidents involving large healthcare, large telecom providers, and in these cases really exposing vast amounts of sensitive data that impacted millions of users. On top of the disruption and the recovering costs, these attacks also led to severe brand and reputation damage for those affected organizations too. A lot of us continue to remember these over time, the names, the brands associated. And then ransomware is an important area of cyber to focus on as well, with attacks becoming increasingly sophisticated as well as more accessible throughout 2024. The rise in the concept and the practice of ransomware as a service has really democratized cybercrime, really allowing attackers with minimal expertise to really execute devastating strikes with devastating impacts. Things like double extortion attacks, where criminals actually encrypt and steal data, are also becoming much more prevalent as well, which puts additional pressures on organizations that are really attempting to respond to these incidents over time. And these types of attacks are also getting cheaper to deploy, while the costs for victims are also rising. So both from ransomware payments as well as from the operational disruptions that businesses obviously incur as a result of cyber crimes. These attacks get increasingly sophisticated and pervasive as well. Organizations are going to have to continue to bear the brunt of the cost, which of course continues to reinforce the importance of a lot of planning, a lot of mitigation efforts across this one area. And then for our final threat, I wanted to talk a little bit about infrastructure vulnerabilities. 2024, again, revealing significant business vulnerabilities due to operational reliance on physical and digital infrastructures. So massive outages, rising demand, accelerating wear, they all undermine the structural integrity of these critical systems often. An organization should obviously expect increased disruptions and more cost for recovery as we move into 2025 and have almost just a month under us. So another really strong data point that I wanted to share off the top on this one, the IT outage impact study from Logic Monitor found that companies with frequent outages, frequent brownouts, experience a 16-time higher cost than those that are facing less downtime. Obviously makes a lot of sense, but organizations, of course, can't control things like electricity demand or the power grid. Plus some of them too are very old and very hard to manage, obviously leading to a lot of what we'll see on the next slide. All right, so physical infrastructure threats, very interconnected here. The power grids, both here in the United States as well in Europe, 50 plus years old, require really extensive upgrades to keep up with current demand, let alone, of course, the projected growth that we're seeing in many of the areas that are obviously relying upon these. Power outages, we experience in them very often. They disrupt business operations that are essential to basically all of the services that we're providing, and they're getting very costly. A single outage at a data center, for example, can cost up to $1 million, with those cascading impacts down to customers, down to operations, vendors, all things impacted. Extreme weather events such as heat waves, floods, hurricanes, all of these events too really amplify a lot of the weaknesses in things like aging bridges, roads, and buildings. So a huge impact that we see on infrastructure there. Cyber attacks too, pretty important here and connected in this area as well, as they pose a growing threat to critical infrastructure globally. Hackers oftentimes trying to target things that are infrastructure related, whether it's power grids, water treatment facilities, transportation networks. And as the threats from climate change and bad actors really increase, these vulnerabilities really endanger local communities. They can have a really far-reaching economic impact and a lot of consequences to everything from supply chain to international networks as well. And I certainly don't have to remind folks about the CrowdStrike incident that happened last summer. Peter, you again mentioned this one off the top. It's an important lesson for a lot of folks to learn in different areas. Incidents like this really underscore the fragility of our interconnected IT systems, and also in many ways reveal just how heavily organizations rely on these digital ecosystems in this day and age. That rapid growth of cloud computing and Internet of Things, those networks have also increased these vulnerabilities, obviously making it easier for a single attack on just one system or just one system failure to cascade across a lot of different sectors and disrupt a lot of different critical services. IT outages can compromise everything from business continuity. They can lead to data loss, halting of operations, right, which is really critical. All of these things resulting in significant reputational damage, a lot of damage to business. And of course, these events across the board are always going to be very costly. All right, so there we have it. Those are the 6 prominent threats that we outlined in our report. Again, just kind of hitting on each one of them: climate change, global election tensions, wars and geopolitics, economic uncertainty, cybercrime, and infrastructure vulnerabilities. Lots of great content and data that we dive into in the report as well outside of this. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it back to Katie.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Yeah, we're going to let you take a breather here for a minute. I'm going to go ahead and launch our next poll. So guys, this time we're asking, which of the 6 prominent threats that Sarah just covered is the highest priority for your organization? Would you say it's the climate extremes? Maybe it's the global election tensions, the wars and the geopolitics, economic uncertainty, cybercrime, or of course those infrastructure vulnerabilities? Tough choice, I know, guys. All right, let's go ahead and we're going to lock those answers in, and then I think we should go ahead and share these results. All right. All right, well, it looks like cybercrime is our top choice, with 41% of our folks on the call selecting that one. But I do want to mention, again, we have every option selected here. So clearly there are concerns for every threat that we mentioned, but cybercrime, and then a second is infrastructure vulnerabilities. Peter, what are your thoughts there?
I'm not surprised by this. I think cybercrime is, it's been around for a while, but it's really ramping up. So I think it's getting a lot of time in the news, and it's making people nervous, and people are realizing just how exposed they can be. And there's a lot of work to do here. So not surprising at all.
Okay. Sarah, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would just note with infrastructure too. I mean, it's interesting to see that as number 2 on the list, but maybe not as surprising. It's interconnected to so many things, as we mentioned, even in the report. Everything from climate to geopol, infrastructure is obviously woven heavily into a lot of the things that we're doing. Just a lot of vulnerabilities there, cyber as well.
That makes a lot of sense. All right. Well, thank you, guys. We're going to move on now to some emerging threats. So, Peter, what should we have on our radar?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll call out a few of the emerging threats that we've got our eye on. So the state of infectious disease is a really massive emerging threat. As everyone knows, the COVID-19 pandemic prove just how catastrophic infectious diseases can be and how quickly a distant outbreak in these days can expand with global impact and super high costs for businesses and just in productivity lost. Then there's the risk and reward of AI technology. Artificial intelligence can certainly improve efficiency, but there's substantial risk involved when using AI tools, like disseminating mis or disinformation and data privacy concerns. Threats to business travelers is another example. Travelers face a really wide range of threats while on the road, from things like travel disruptions to terrorism. Global business travel is actually expected to keep increasing this year, just like it has every year since the pandemic. And then last is drone threats. I don't think a lot of people would have thought of this a few years ago, but the technical term for drones is unmanned aircraft systems, or UAS, and they really pose an emerging threat to safety and security for businesses actually of all kinds, not just like big organizations or certain industries. But they're a specific concern for restricted areas like correctional facilities, airports, critical infrastructure, military locations, obviously, as well as large open air event centers such as sports arenas. I actually recently had drone expert Ryan Wallace on the Employee Safety Podcast, who we quote in the report, and he told some pretty wild stories about bad actors using drones to do some pretty bad stuff and how quickly the technology is evolving. It really is growing very fast. I actually recommend you give that episode a listen if you can. Remember, the Employee Safety Podcast. You can find it out there. Now, I would like to talk about another threat that I know is important to all of you, especially over the last few years, and that is burnout. The growing scale of threats that safety, security, business continuity, and resilience teams are having to deal with has really created an often overlooked consequence, and that's burnout. Employees on these teams are working to manage and prevent really increasingly complex and impactful incidents, and many are doing so with a lot less funding, fewer resources, and less headcount in the most recent years. So do more, but we're going to give you less. So not a good recipe. Looking at the numbers here, burnout, stress, and being overwhelmed are just industry-wide concerns. It's everywhere. One report actually shows that about 63% of security professionals experience just some level of burnout, and about 80% say their workloads have increased just in the past year alone. Another study found about 84% of cybersecurity workers report experiencing a lot of stress, fatigue, and burnout. So that kind of goes back to what everyone just shared on the poll that we gave. Cybersecurity is stressing people out big time. So the impact of this is, I would say really, it's like an invisible internal threat can actually, think about what we talked about at the beginning, cascade and then compromise the very foundation of safety, security, and operational continuity that all these teams exist to support. You've got to keep your eye on that and the cascading effect that can occur. All right, with that, let's go ahead and switch gears now and talk about some preparedness tips and strategies. We just spent a lot of time talking about how the threat landscape is evolving, but we should also acknowledge how the workforce also has evolved and become more dispersed. To continue fulfilling your duty of care in today's very rapidly changing environment, your emergency preparedness, risk mitigation, and employee safety plans also need to evolve. So today, duty of care really extends to remote workers in their home offices, lone workers out in the field or on a job site, or it could just simply be business travelers wherever they might be in the world, and they're always in different places. But even your commuters as well, coming into an office. They all might rely on aging infrastructure for transportation to the office, which could cascade and impact your business. So in today's threat landscape, managing a single threat often means managing a cascade of consequences far beyond the initial event, as we discussed at the very beginning of the presentation. So protecting your people, maintaining operations, and achieving resilience all require a multidimensional approach to risk management. So here are 6 strategies that you see that'll help you get closer to those goals and then help you better navigate the threats of 2025. So first and foremost, think about decentralizing operations for more resilient continuity. This really reduces the chances of unilateral disruption by reducing your dependency on central hubs and decentralizing a lot of the central functions you come to depend on. I know it's efficient, but you got to think about when bad things happen. So next, enhanced threat modeling with a lot of scenario-based training, very helpful. This really advances your training and critical event response practice beyond those generic tabletop exercises, which are valuable, but the scenario-based training can be very helpful too. Third, you want to develop geo-specific contingencies to improve response. The level of specific planning, when you get down to that level, really ensures quicker and more targeted responses and better resource allocation than trying to manage it from afar. And then fourth, don't forget to prioritize ESG and regulation compliance to prevent any kind of additional risk. Just be sure to integrate those risks into your external threat assessment planning and all the training that you do. And then next, find your force multipliers where you can to maximize effort wherever it's possible. So identify and use any tools and strategies or processes that allow your business to achieve more with fewer resources, which is important as we're given less resources to deal with an increasing level of threats. And then lastly here, be sure to invest in cross-industry collaboration to share a lot of good critical insights, things that you see that others don't, and vice versa. Collaborative networks can drive all sorts of really creative joint solutions. They can mitigate sector-specific risks, and they can help predict trends before they directly affect your business. So that's why it's really useful to do that. So in other words, just get out of your sandbox and go play in some other sandboxes. You'll be really surprised by what you see and learn. So hopefully these strategies resonated with you, or at least gave you some food for thought as we get further into the new year. Katie, back to you.
Thank you so much, Peter. That's great advice. I want to just quickly launch our last poll now, and this one will be quick because I do have some additional resources to share with you guys, specifically a QR code where you can download the report. And of course, we'll get to some audience questions as well. So our last question that we have here for you all today is, would you like to learn more about how AlertMedia can help you monitor and respond to developing risks? Sara and Peter are just two of our many subject matter experts that we have at AlertMedia. We have a whole team of folks that are ready to assist you should you choose. So you can choose yes, and we will get you the information that you need. You could also say no, not right now. No hard feelings. You know where to find us if you need us. So while we are waiting for folks to get their answers locked in, why don't you guys think of a great question that you have for Peter and Sara, because we got questions coming up. All right. Speaking of, we are getting some great questions from you guys, but first I did want to clarify something just really quickly. We've heard from a couple of you that our handout within the platform has different information on slide 11 than what we presented. Actually not quite sure what happened there, so I am going to get to the bottom of that and we will make sure to fix it for all of you before we send this out. So with that caveat said, I'm going to go ahead and get to our first question. Okay. Peter, you mentioned groups or associations that people could join to get some collaboration, work with their peers a little bit. Do you have specifics that you could recommend?
Yeah, and we could follow up with this later with something more formal, but just off the top of my head, and Sara, if you want to come in over the top too, I'm thinking like ASIS, ASIS for security professionals, ACP for business continuity professionals, the Association of Contingency Planners, and then OSAC for security professionals as well, OSAC. I think those are three great organizations to start with if you're not familiar. And Sara, I don't know if you have any other things you would mention as well.
I would echo all three of those. They're great and certainly valuable. I would also say there's a lot of markets and a lot of cities where there's actually like analyst groups or different groups that have kind of organized on their own. I know there is one in Charlotte. I know Silicon Valley has a great group. So there are some localized groups as well that meet quite frequently that you can kind of look into and jump on with. Some of them business continuity folks, some more security focused, and some of them really blended, really just looking to help support their industries with situational awareness, which is great.
Excellent. Well, Sara, I'm actually going to stick with you for a minute. Do you foresee increases in hybrid attacks, both cyber and physical, happening concurrently?
Okay, I think, this person is probably talking about attacks that I believe are probably cyber in nature. So the attack itself is actually cyber with potential physical infrastructure or other related impacts. And I would say like This is definitely likely. One of the things we continue to see and note is the advancements in a lot of different cyber attacks that we're seeing, especially kind of the barrier of entry with different attacks. A lot of people are learning very quickly, unfortunately, bad actors, how to access systems. There's a lot of vulnerabilities with the more technology that we use. One of the things I know my team and I were talking about yesterday, this dates back probably 3 years, but the Colonial Pipeline here in the United States was attacked, like 3 years ago, and that caused a number of different physical impacts with gas supply, with supplies at pumps. It came to mind because, of course, there's a leak on their line in Georgia right now. So there's a lot of questions, of course, and just kind of reminiscing about that. But just kind of bottom line, it's definitely something I would expect to see more of in the future as bad actors really take advantage of using new and different technology, things that are more easy to access, and of course, wanting to have more of those physical impacts.
And if I might add to that, there's a slight twist on that. You'll see as well this crossover from cyber into physical. I've heard a number of organizations tell me that bad actors will do something out there in the cyber world to get someone riled up, thinking a company or a person at a company wants something from that person, either positive or negative. And then that person, maybe mentally unstable or getting a little aggravated, will actually physically go to that organization and then try to cause some kind of harm or go see that person. So it's definitely something to watch out for as well.
Thank you both. Sarah, I'm going to go back to you first on this one. It's a bit of a comment and then a question. So I understand the concern with cyber attack activities. We've been noticing an increase in workplace violence support requests lately as well. Do you guys foresee an increase or more focus on physical attacks on organizations, whether from an internal or an external actor? Sarah,
sure. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of things that probably bring this one to the forefront. Of course, what we saw with United Health Group, with the CEO, obviously that was a major physical attack, hopefully something that we don't see as a trend. One of the things that I think is probably important to note in this area, and just with maybe an uptick, but also an uptick in vulnerability, is we do see a lot of businesses that are going back in person over the past year, right? With certain days a week that people are expected to be in the office. So I think there's definitely more sensitivity with more people in an office environment, physically in close proximity. And of course, a lot of things that can come into play with that. That's one of the factors that I think a lot of people are considering right now as well.
Anything to add there, Peter?
No, I was just going to mention that return to RTO, return to office. I think we're just, with that many more people going back, we're going to see more incidents, not just in offices, but road rage is going to increase. All sorts of issues will pop up from it. So it's just something to think about.
Absolutely. Well, Peter, I'm going to stick with you for a second. We have some folks wondering what trends didn't make the list this year. What else did AlertMedia look into that wasn't one of the top 6?
Well, one that we just kind of we talked about, which is this concept of insider threats. A lot of enterprise organizations are looking into that and thinking about it more deeply. So it didn't make the list, but it's right there on the tip. Another one is destination migration. And this is just people moving to disaster-prone areas. It's, a long time ago, people didn't live in places like Florida or Houston, Texas, because you had hurricanes and really hot, humid weather and things like that. But the land was cheap, so the people came. And now you've got places that used to have maybe 500,000 people, now having 5, 6, 7 million people living there. So when the next storm rolls through, it's the same storm that happened 100 years ago, but this time it impacts 7, 14 times as many people in the infrastructure that supports them as before. So always be thinking about your organization directly. And if you have people go into these destinations that are prone to disaster, or if you've got suppliers and things like that that rely on these areas, very important to think about.
Very good. All right. This is a great question, and I'm so glad someone asked it. Except it just went away. Where'd it go? Okay. How do you get senior managers' attention to be more proactive toward emerging threats? Peter, why don't you answer that one first?
Oh, man, that's a tough one.
On the spot.
Yeah. I say probably the easiest way to do that is twofold. Number one, come to the table with anecdotal stories, because that's going to tug at the heartstrings of those people. But it doesn't make executives want to spend money. What makes them want to spend money are hard facts. So use the information that organizations like AlertMedia put out. There's lots more out there, and give them very cold, hard facts about the statistics and what's going on. So tug at the heartstrings with those anecdotal stories to get them to listen and emotionally buy in that, yeah, there's something wrong here, but then help them justify everything with logical facts in these reports and back it up. Super important. Just don't rely on the anecdotes alone.
That's a great answer. Sara, not sure if you'll be able to answer this one, but let's try. How soon do you see a worldwide population decline becoming a major threat to organizations?
So when I think about population decline, I mean, there's a lot of things that come to mind, but when I think about it just from a business perspective, right, it's our workforce. People do the jobs, right? But I think as we complement that with the rise in AI, and I know there's a lot of conversations around artificial intelligence, the good, the bad, the ugly. I think there's a lot of complementary things that could probably happen in the business landscape to offset people that aren't in the workforce anymore. So when I think about population, that's probably the first thing that comes to mind at this point off the top of my mind.
Anything about there, Peter?
I'm very optimistic that AI and robotics combined with AI is not going to turn into Terminator. It's going to actually help supplement the declining population, which is already happening around the world. I just read an article the other day that there's fewer 18-year-olds out there now. So colleges are starting to worry about that. And they're thinking, how are we going to keep students coming in the door? Like, it's just every industry is being impacted by that. But I know that through AI and robotics, it's going to help out tremendously. That's my belief.
Yep. Very good. Sara, do you have any resources that you recommend for folks to stay current on some of these trends?
Yeah, sure. I think I would say a few things. Number one, obviously, our report is a really good starting point. There's a lot of really good reports that are released throughout the year. I was just scanning through the World Economic Forum. Obviously, Davos is upon us. The World Economic Forum puts out a really good kind of dense report as well that I think is really important to stay on top of. I think is a lot of you guys I saw were asking in the chat box about the deck that we provide. There's a lot of different data within our deck that is coming from different sources and resources. Those are also really great things to kind of keep an eye on. There's a lot of different data that will continue to publish kind of periodically throughout the year by a lot of these different kind of industry groups and institutions that are very focused in these areas. So I would say those ones. I obviously, being a former journalist, I pay a lot of attention to more of kind of mainstream media on fact-based things, a lot of different information around different things that are happening around the globe. I would say those are probably really good starting points and kind of my go-tos.
Excellent. And then Sara, another one for you here. Can you just clarify the difference between misinformation and disinformation, please?
Yes, absolutely. This is a common question because I think a lot of people are like, well, isn't it just the same thing? There is an actual difference. It's an important difference. Misinformation is really just basic sharing of information that happens to be false or maybe even misleading. It's very unintentional when people are sharing misinformation, whereas when people are sharing disinformation, it's really that intent. The purpose of doing that is very intentional sharing that information that is incorrect or misleading.
All right, so let's see here. Okay, Peter, I'm going to go back to you because there's a question here about duty of care, and I know you are our duty of care expert. Can you explain more about how that relates to dispersed and traveling employees?
Oh, sure. Yeah. And I kind of alluded to this earlier in the presentation, but I'm sure most people know this, but in case you don't, duty of care is the moral and increasingly legal responsibility to take care of any people associated with your organization. It could be employees, visitors, on-site customers. There's a lot of folks that could be dependent on you. And until recently, there was some concept of duty of care for travelers, although that was mostly around VIPs, key executives and things like that, and almost none for remote workers. That just wasn't a thing before COVID. But that has changed, and the law is actually pushing things forward. There's actually stories we're hearing of people who experienced health incidents or even death while working from home, and insurance companies are basically required to consider those incidents as workplace incidents. That never would have happened, 10, 15 years ago. But beyond the legal implications, your business will suffer if people don't feel safe, whether they're in the office or anywhere out there doing work for you. If people don't feel safe, they can't be optimally productive. So it's really important to get ahead of it. with just a little investment, you can improve not only safety, but also productivity. So it's a win-win for the employee feeling safer, but also being more productive for the organization.
Thank you so much, Peter. All right. Well, that is all the time that we have for questions. Thank you guys so much for submitting such great ones. And as I promised all of you, I have a quick and easy QR code here that you can use to download the report should you choose. So if you want to get your phones out and snap a quick picture, I'll leave that up for just a moment. Sara and Peter, I really just want to thank you guys for joining us today. Really appreciate you sharing your experience and expertise. Peter, I'll start with you. It's always a pleasure working with you. Thanks for being here.
Indeed. Thank you. And keep the feedback coming in, guys. If you tell us what you like, tell us what you'd like to see more of, and we can adjust for next time.
Perfect. And Sara, I don't know how you talk for 30 minutes straight, but you kept it all perfectly eloquent and in sync. So thank you so much for your time and your expertise as well.
Absolutely. Lots of data, lots of good stuff to share. And just thanks to everybody for questions. It's really helpful to kind of see the things that y'all are interested in or experiencing. It really kind of helps us to keep an eye on what you guys are really focusing on as well.
Yeah, it helps us inform future content for webinars too. So love it. Well, here is Sara and Peter's contact information. If you would like to keep the conversation going, or if you come up with a question later that you would like to have answered, you can reach out to them. And at this time, that's it for us. Just want to thank everybody for coming today. We hope to see you on a future AlertMedia webinar. And of course, I want to thank Security Magazine for being such an amazing partner. You guys are the best.